Hey guys, it's Sheila and I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. This is a series where I just chat about the last 10 books that I read. I read a lot of books and I like to take a minute to reflect on what I've read, to keep a log of what I've read, and mostly just to pass on the great titles that I've been reading to you guys. My usual disclaimer for these videos is that these are my personal subjective opinions on what I was reading. I do give books a numerical rating because I use Goodreads and it asks for one, but I ultimately think that that is very arbitrary and kind of pointless. It's not some kind of objective grading rubric. These are obviously just my very subjective opinions, and if you feel differently about a book than I did, that is totally fine. The point of these videos is not to put value on these books or say which books are valuable or important or worth reading. They all are. I am quite behind, not on just these videos, but on YouTube in general. I haven't had a chance to film anything in months. I've been so busy. I just went on back-to-back trips, like big trips. I went on a almost month-long trip to Asia and was reading a lot because there was so much like transit time, but I'm really behind. I really haven't had any chance to film anything. I did forget to take notes on a few of the books that I read while I was traveling. I just didn't have the chance, so I hope that my thoughts are still a little coherent, even though a few of them I read kind of in a daze a while ago and I didn't take notes afterwards. Don't expect much from my descriptions of what the books are about in this video because some of them it has been quite a while since I read them. So if I don't really talk about what a book is about, just you can look it up, it's fine. So the first book that I read was Poor Dear by Claire Oshetsky. This really stood out to me because it was like a fabulistic, dark fable kind of style, and something that I am planning to write again in this style for my master's thesis, and so I wanted to read something to kind of get me in that, start reading a bit more in that style. So this book follows a little girl who, when she's 4, she's playing with her friend and the friend ends up dying, and it's kind of about how this folkloric figure called Poor Dear kind of haunts this girl throughout her whole life as kind of a manifestation of the guilt. I was hoping for something fabulistic, dark, and original, and this absolutely lived up in all of those respects. It's a really strange story that kind of asks what physical shape guilt takes and what happens when guilt and grief are inextricable, as well as what happens when these things happen at such a young age that they truly shape someone. Even though the child copes with trauma through fairy tale concept is pretty overdone and we've seen a lot, this felt extremely original. And it was just overall a quirky but approachable book. If you like fairy tale or fable style work, I would definitely recommend this. I think that this is a pretty excellent addition to that kind of style of work. Then I read Alphabetical Diaries by Sheila Heti. This was my first Sheila Heti book, and I read it because I went to the event that she was doing locally for this book, and I'd never read any of her work before, but I felt like I should just go, you know, it'll be interesting. And she was so interesting, and the way she talked about this book was so interesting. So this book is literally what the title sounds like. So basically Sheila Heti took her diary entries over a pretty long span of time and she alphabetized them. She put them in a program that alphabetized them sentence by sentence, so every sentence from her journals were in alphabetical order. And then she took that and she started just whittling down until she got this book. And so it was a book that had, like, I think she described it as no writing but all editing. And it sounds weird and it sounds like it shouldn't work, but it works brilliantly. Like, even though it's completely out of order, like you're reading the sentences completely out of order, they flow together beautifully and you get a sense of an overall narrative. I think I tabbed a page because I felt like I have to read a page in order to explain to you what this is like. So this is from the end chapter because the book is alphabetical. Neglect my friends and family. Never having felt so sad. New sheets for the bed. New York, I think, made me depressed. Nice after we were done to lie there holding him, but at a certain point it became too much and that is when I had to leave. 9 years later, almost the exact same thing. No checking email on Sunday. No justification is needed. No kiss at all. No love is perfect. No matter how nice or interesting these people are, it doesn't feel worth the trouble. No matter what direction I went in, I would probably always have some suspicion of myself, some criticisms. No more controlling, no more Facebook, no more mysticism, or not so much. No more playing a part, no more second guessing. And it's just so hypnotic. My notes here were, this shouldn't work, but it does. And my second note was, Sheila Heti writes for hot girls. I was talking about this with my roommate and how I feel like a lot of authors are now dubbed as like hot girl books. I feel like Sheila Heti is a hot girl author. and she should be included in that canon. Why are we not talking about this? Okay, I have to read my notes here because it's been a while since I read this. I said, hypnotic, insightful, intimate, not just an exercise in experimentation, but a kaleidoscopic portrait of a brilliant writer's mind, one that feels wise but also deeply relatable and refreshingly normal at the same time as it is revelatory. That was actually quite a well put together sentence. Clearly the two types of notes that I write. The thing about this book is that it shouldn't work, but it does. It really doesn't feel like it should work, but it does, and it's actually really emotional. And I think what's especially impressive about it is that a book like this could feel like it was just an exercise in doing something experimental, but it didn't feel like that. It actually felt extremely purposeful. When you read it, you're not reading it thinking, oh, she just did this kind of as a thought experiment. It actually feels like a really cohesive work. Then I read Desperada by Sofia Mostaghimi. It's basically just about a woman whose sister dies, and it's just about her kind of like chaotically traveling the world in the wake of her sister's death. This book is very messy. Human and messy, I would say. The main character feels very real. She makes a lot of messy decisions, and you understand why she's making them. It feels quite tender to be in her presence as she's making messy decisions. Not always bad decisions, but just messy decisions. I did think in the middle it kind of got stuck on its own pacing. Like, it gets a bit repetitive as we're just watching these different episodes of her traveling. Kind of similar things start happening, but the end I thought is ultimately really impactful. Nearing the end I kind of realized that there was actually a narrative arc happening, even if in the middle I couldn't feel it. So like there were things that in the middle felt kind of inconsequential, but then when I got to the end it was actually quite impactful, and I was like, oh, this actually was purposeful and there was a narrative arc. It felt like kind of a really meaningful endpoint for the story. Then I read Now She Is Witch by Kirsty. Logan. It's like a fantastical kind of medieval situation about a woman who's accused of witchcraft, and then she meets this other woman. They kind of team up together to do like a revenge plot against those who have wronged them. I thought this was incredibly atmospheric and immersive. The way she writes is so unique. It actually reminded me the most of Girl, Woman, Other by Bernstein in that she's using line breaks, and it starts like there's no capital letters, and it all kind of is starting to like fall apart. It's a very unique style of writing. I thought it worked very well. This is very otherworldly. It feels both historical and modern. It feels both real and fantastical, but it makes sense atmospherically. Like, it doesn't really feel like a historical novel, but it's definitely not modern. It's not set in the modern day either. It's definitely not real, but it also doesn't really feel like fantasy either. It kind of just feels like everything at once. It's its own unique thing. The writing was definitely so inventive and emotive. Had some brilliant moments for sure. The plot is wild. It was a little jumbled, a little scattered to me at points. You know, it often feels like we're just jumping from wild plot point to wild plot point, but not really in like a progressing through a narrative type of way. I can't say I ever felt too close to the characters either despite that, but it definitely did deliver on a lot of aspects, especially in terms of like atmosphere and vibe. If you're a big atmosphere vibe reader, this definitely lands in those regards. Then I read The Museum of Human History by Rebekah Bergman. So this is kind of like a futuristic type thing about this girl. She's 8 and she nearly drowns, and so then she falls into like a comatose state, but then she ends up she stops aging. Her kind of infinite sleep has become this kind of scientific marvel. So it's quite speculative. We follow a lot of different characters. My first note for this was puzzling, quietly trippy, I think is actually the best way to describe this. It is pretty trippy, but quietly so. It's very speculative, but it also feels very quiet in a way. And everything is kind of just swirling down the drain. To me, this was much more concept-based than character-based. So I didn't have a ton of emotional connection to the characters because it was really conceptual. I wouldn't even call it plot-driven, and it wasn't character-driven, it was very concept-driven. But it was really fascinating to see the story knit together because you're following all these different characters, and it kind of slowly pieces together, and you slowly get this broader picture that kind of creates this overall weird sci-fi psychedelic kind of situation. So if you like really, really concept-driven fiction, especially one that is speculative but also pretty, like, it's not really sci-fi, like it's kind of maybe more like concept leaning speculative literary fiction. Maybe that's a very specific niche, but this might be up your alley. So then I read Study for Obedience by Bernstein. So this book follows a woman who goes to go live in a rural area with her brother whose wife has just left him. And then weird stuff starts happening around the farm. This is one that I unfortunately forgot to take notes on because I was reading it like the day before I left for a trip, and so it just slipped my mind. But I do remember that this was very strange, very cerebral, very moody. I remember thinking, to me this was very like Ali Smith, Rachel Cusk-esque. So I think if you like either of those authors, you might really like this. Actually, Alphabetical Diaries was also Ali Smith-esque. It really reminded me of some of the opening chapters of the Seasons Quartet. You know, they had those like repetition chapters, really reminded me of that. Anyways, side note, it was very moody. It's not horror, but in some ways it gave like The Witch, like the Robert Eggers movie vibes, except like not horror, just in the like, we're on a farm homestead situation and all this weird stuff is happening. The family dynamics are a weird kind of situation. It was like that if it wasn't horror, if it was like a like literary fiction, very like cerebral kind of book. So now we're gonna get into some books that I was reading while I was traveling, so I don't have them with me. So first I read Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which has been on my list for ages because it's, you know, the lesbian fantasy book. It's one of my girlfriend's favorite books also, so I really wanted to read it and chat about it with her. I'm really bad at describing epic fantasy, but different women, fantasy world, political intrigue, dragons, lesbianism, basically what you need to know. This was definitely quite masterful. It was very richly written and very richly built. The world building felt very, very deep, and I got the sense that it went even much deeper than what we were taught on the page. The writing was lush, it was delicious. I prefer a work where I get closer to the cast, feel closer to the cast. But I also can't really fault this on a technical level for exceeding at its purpose. I think big epic fantasy is usually not really my thing. I thought that this was really excellent and really masterfully done for what it is. I think every few years I read a multi-POV epic high fantasy novel and then remember that I don't really enjoy multi-POV epic high fantasy novels, and I'm very picky about them, you know? And even ones that I really, really love, like I love like Live Ship by Ramen Hobb, they do start to exhaust me to read pretty quickly. I think my attention span is too short for these kinds of books, but that's a personal failing. I think for me, these books, and Priory is a good example, often dedicate a lot of time to stuff that is less interesting to me, but that would be very interesting to the right target audience, like the politics and the world intricacies, whereas for me, I really just care about the characters and their relationships. And what we got of the characters and their relationships was really, really interesting and really, really well done. But I think for me, a book like this does have a lot of content that isn't as interesting to me, but that's just because maybe I am not really the target audience for these kinds of books. So that's on me. So then I read Mysterious Fragrance of the Yellow Mountains by Yasuko Thanh. I read this with my mom actually because we were in Vietnam at the time, and so I was like, oh, well, why don't we read this book set in Vietnam? And it's set in like, oh, I can't remember, it's like the early 1900s. I feel like most historical fiction set in Vietnam is all set during the Vietnam War. And a lot of the time it's from an American perspective, which I personally am not really interested in reading about. And so this was following Vietnamese characters in the like French colonial era, which was a period of Vietnamese history that obviously I had learned a little bit about from having gone to Vietnam twice, but that I don't feel like I've seen really depicted in any other books that I've read. I thought this started super interesting. The characters, very interesting setups for all the characters. We had a really interesting cast. And then it got kind of muddled in the middle. A lot got introduced, and then it never really met in a super interesting way. A lot of the most interesting characters that I thought were introduced didn't really become focal points. And then it got really interesting again after it got muddled, and then it got kind of muddled again. This was a bit on and off for me. I think I got really excited at these points in the story where we were introducing some really, really interesting stuff, and then it would kind of lose me when I feel like that stuff was not really ever coming together in a cohesive way or really paying off in a very interesting way. But then more stuff would get introduced that was really interesting, and I kind of grabbed my attention again. She's definitely an excellent writer, and the book was very moody and interesting. For the purpose of reading it to learn about that era of Vietnamese history, I did find it really interesting. So then I read Half-Blood Blues by Edugyan, which I unfortunately also didn't take notes on. I really love Edugyan's other book. Well, she's written several books, but the other one of hers that I've read, Washington Black, one of my favorite novels. Fantastic book. This is like a World War II era jazz music kind of situation, following characters involved in the jazz music scene in World War II, but then also a few decades later, kind of alternating. I wish I could better remember my thoughts on this. I wish I had taken notes on it. I think this one was a little underwhelming to me. I definitely say if you want to get into work, read Washington Black. It's a 10 out of 10 for me. This one, I think I found like the characters really interesting, and I did find this setup of the story very interesting, but there were a lot of points where I just felt like I wasn't really going anywhere and it wasn't really holding my attention, and the timeline was a little bit, it's not like it was confusing, but I sometimes felt a little unrooted from these time skips. But the elements that were there, like the characters and, you know, the relationships, I did find really interesting. Anyways, read Washington Black, and then if you love it, maybe try this one if the like time period and the concept really interests you. So the final book that I read here, Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, which you guys have been bothering me to read for ages, and I've been meaning to read for ages. This is a kind of nothing happens coming of age book about two girls who are best friends in Naples, in Italy. This is really my kind of book. Like, everyone who told me to read this, you guys knew this was my type of book. It's like a nothing happens, but you can't help be so compelled by the really rich inner world of these characters. They're both so human and well drawn and relatable, but also really specific and really enlightening. If you want a book that has a clear plot, this won't be for you, but if you like a book that's just really interesting characters, they're not weird or strange, like they're very specific and they feel very real, but they also feel like real people that you could meet, and it's just them living their lives. Yeah, this was fantastic. I kind of knew this would be fantastic. I'd been meaning to read it for ages. And to me, this definitely lived up to the hype. So to end this video, I wanted to do a little poetry wrap up. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I stopped covering poetry in these videos, even though I have still been reading poetry, and it's because I feel like I don't have much to say about the poetry that I read. Like, I really enjoy poetry, but I've never studied it, and I feel like I don't really know how to talk about it. I'll read poetry and I'll have feelings on it, but I don't really know how to express it or critique it or talk about it in a super useful way. I found myself avoiding poetry in my reading life because I didn't know how to talk about it in these videos, and then I realized that I'd only read one poetry collection last year. I really enjoy reading poetry, and so I realized that I wasn't reading poetry because I felt like I didn't know how to talk about it in these videos, which is not a good reason to not read something you enjoy. So I've decided from now on to skip the poetry in these videos in recent reads and not really talk about it in depth, and every several videos, like every 3 or 4, just at the end do a little roundup of all the poetry that I read and enjoyed. And if I read one and I don't enjoy it, I'm gonna skip it. But I usually do really enjoy most, if not all, of the poetry I read, because I get pretty much all my poetry suggestions directly from friends of mine who are very accomplished poets, and I just read what they tell me to read. And so I feel like I tend to, as long as I'm following their suggestions, really enjoy the poetry I read. When I start veering off and picking my own poetry, then sometimes I don't enjoy it as much. So I'm not really going to talk about these in depth. I'm just going to quickly run through the poetry that I've read over the past, this is like 6 or 7 months. So first up, More Sure by A. Zachary. This was fantastic. Queerness, non-binary identity, neurodivergent stuff going on with this one that was really interesting. Then I read Xanax Cowboy by Hannah Green. I thought this was really a triumph. The main character is a character called Xanax Cowboy, and basically the book is a western, but it's about addiction. It's just really brilliant. Then I read The All Plus Flesh by Brandy Bird. The collection is about health, language, indigeneity, relationship to place. It's fantastic. I've read some Brandy Bird in the past, and I think I really enjoyed their poetry, so I knew I would love this. Then I read My Grief the Sun by Sanawani. This was also such a highlight for me. These poems were really emotive, but also felt really relatable. There's a lot of really interesting pop culture reference. A lot of it is about kind of like faith, grief, Kashmiri diaspora. Really fantastically done. Then I read Dear God, Your Bones Still Yellow by Noor Hindi. This one covers a ton of different topics: religion, colonialism, Palestinian diaspora, art. It's hard to pick a favorite from this list, but maybe my favorite one. And then the final one I wanted to cover here is Gay Girl Prayers by Emily Austin. This is basically a queer reimagining of Catholic aesthetic, and so it's basically written as prayers, but it's all about queerness. This one I think was maybe for me my least favorite on this list, just because I think a lot of the poems were very simple, very short, but there were definitely some highlights. There were some really, really fun ones. And as a concept, I really, really like this, and I do think this one is really, really approachable. I think the others on this list, most of them might be less approachable to someone who is new to poetry, but I think if you are new to poetry, if you're interested in the concept of gay girl prose, it's really approachable. You're never gonna not know what a poem is about. You're never gonna struggle to understand any of the poems. The other one I'd recommend if you maybe are new to poetry would probably be Xanax Cowboy, because it is such a clear concept and it actually like is structured like a whole narrative, like it's like a Western. The others I think probably maybe would be more interesting to poetry readers because they can be a little more like opaque in the concepts and everything, but I personally really enjoyed that, and I think if you read a lot of poetry, all the books I just mentioned, fantastic. Like I think I gave everyone on this list 5 stars except for Gay Girl Prose, just because in some points it wasn't my style. So that's my quick little poetry wrap up. So that's all for this episode of Recent Reads. As always, I would love to know what you guys have been reading lately, what you've been loving. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!